The press hall felt less like a room for questions and more like a theater. Rows of plastic chairs groaned under the weight of fans, journalists, trainers, and hanger-ons. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, bouncing white glare off polished tables where bottles of water stood in neat military lines. A dozen cameras squatted at the back like black insects, lenses trained forward, waiting to snatch a headline out of air. The young fighter leaned into the microphone, his jaw sharp under the lights, sweat from the open workout still glistening along his neck. He had the grin of a man who knew every syllable was ammunition. He didn't wait for a question. He didn't need one. "Chuck Norris?" he said, and the room shifted in an instant. Even the shuffle of reporters' notes slowed. Then he let the smile sharpen. "He's too weak for this sport. Way too weak." The words detonated. The hall burst into noise. Laughter from the fighters' fans, gasps from the old-school crowd, a hiss of whispers from the press row as keyboards began clattering. Some shouted approval, stomping feet. Others booed loudly enough to rattle the ceiling tiles. The fighter soaked it in. He leaned back in his chair, arms spread wide like he'd just opened a sermon. "Come on," he shouted over the noise. "Let's be honest. Those old legends wouldn't last a single minute in the UFC today. You think Chuck could stand in there with me? With anyone at the top of this division? He'd fold in 30 seconds. Laughter rippled through half the room. The other half stiffened. Reporters glanced at one another with expressions that mixed shock and delight. They didn't need to hunt for tomorrow's headline anymore. The headline had just punched them in the mouth. Phones lit up like torches, recording, streaming, tweeting. A producer near the back muttered into a headset, "We've got our clip. This is going everywhere." The fighter wasn't finished. He slapped the table once, loud, grinning wide. "Legends don't belong in this sport anymore. It's a new era. They had their time, but this is different. It's faster, harder, real. And Chuck Norris? He's a meme. He's a joke people post online. That's it." The audience boiled. Two men in faded martial arts jackets shouted from the back, "Don't disrespect Chuck." A woman in the front row cupped her hands and screamed, "Say that again." The fighter grinned at her, tilted his head, and said into the mic, louder, "I said he's too weak." The laugh that followed was harsh, forced through the speakers until it cracked. Some cheered, others hissed. A chant almost started, half jeering, half defending, but collapsed into chaos before it found a rhythm. On the journalist's side, camera shutters rattled like machine gun fire. One correspondent whispered to his neighbor, "This'll lead SportsCenter." No doubt. Another kept his camera locked not on the fighter but on the crowd, sensing that the story wasn't just what was said but how people swallowed it. And then the angle changed. Someone pointed. A murmur spread. The camera operators turned, lenses zooming, catching a face in the middle of the guest section. Chuck Norris. He sat 3 rows back, not in the spotlight, no entourage around him. Just a man in a simple jacket, arms folded, posture straight. The years had traced lines along his face, but the eyes were sharp, ice-colored under the lights. He hadn't reacted when the insult first landed. He hadn't shifted in his seat, hadn't whispered to the person beside him. He just sat, still, letting silence do the work. The cameras drank him in. On the giant side screens, his face appeared, expression unreadable, gaze fixed straight ahead. He didn't blink. The crowd noticed. The laughter cut shorter this time. Even the fighter at the table faltered, the grin twitching as he caught the image on the big screen behind him. "Yeah," he barked suddenly, louder, pushing the crack out of his voice. "Yeah, I see you, Chuck. You hear me? Too weak. Too old. You don't belong here." The room groaned, half in shock, half in thrill. Phones shot up, capturing both men in the same frame. The young fighter snarling at the mic, the older man silent, cold, unflinching. The comparison was cruel and perfect. A few fans couldn't take it. They stood, shouting, "Don't touch Chuck. Respect the legend." The noise became a wall, one side screaming approval, the other side spitting fury. And still Chuck didn't move. The fighter laughed again, shaking his head, trying to ride the chaos. "Look at him, folks. Not even a word. That's the truth, silence. He knows it." But silence wasn't absence. It was weight. The longer Norris sat unmoved, the heavier the air grew. Reporters stopped laughing. Fans who cheered the insult found their voices stuck. Even the lights felt too hot, buzzing faintly against the ceiling panels as if amplifying the pause. The camera stayed on him, his face calm, almost relaxed. But his eyes were ablaze. And the crowd saw it. The noise shifted, not louder, not quieter, just different. The laughter became nervous, the cheers ragged. The silence of one man in the third row had turned a room of hundreds. The fighter swallowed. His bravado suddenly worked. He tried to push through it, pounding the mic again, spitting more words into the storm. But no sentence landed harder than the look from the man he'd mocked. And everyone in the hall knew it. The real fight had already begun, and not a single punch had been thrown. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. The clip of the insult hit social media before the noise in the hall had even settled. A teenager in the back row had it up on TikTok within 30 seconds. Twitter carried it faster, half the trending page already arguing in real time. Some comments defended the fighter's bravado, others spat fury. You don't talk about Chuck like that. Inside the room, people began to sense they weren't just watching a press event. They were inside something leaking far beyond the walls. The fluorescent lights seemed louder now, buzzing against the ceiling panels. Heat rose from the packed rows. Half the crowd kept their eyes on the fighter at the dais, still smirking, still feeding off their noise. The other half had turned in their seats, staring at the third row where Chuck Norris sat, still as stone. The fighter pushed back from the table, chair legs screeching against the stage. He lifted the mic close, smirk widening. If he thinks he still belongs, he said, voice rising, step into the octagon. Give me 1 round. Hell, give me 1 minute. He won't last past the bell. The hall erupted. Some roared approval, stomping feet, banging chairs. Others booed hard, long, deep. The sound fractured into currents, pockets for and against, none of them polite. Ushers along the aisles raised hands, but the storm had no order now. The host leaned forward, trying to reassert control. Let's keep it to scheduled questions. His voice was buried under laughter and jeers. The fighter caught it, laughed along, slapped the mic with his palm to make the speakers pop. Schedule? Forget the schedule. You've got the fight right here. Give the people what they want. Phones swarmed above heads. Blue-white light painted faces as the chant began, hesitant first, then louder. Chuck! Chuck! From the opposite side came an answer. New era. The two chants collided, words tangled into static. Journalists sensed the shift instantly. A veteran reporter with a lined face lifted her camera, steady hands catching the crowd, not the stage. Another tapped furiously at his keyboard, whispering, "This is already out of control. We're not covering sports anymore. This is history." The fighter fed the chaos. He pointed into the seats where Norris Saturday. He's right there. You all see him. Don't hide behind silence, old man. Show us if you've got anything left. The camera swung again, finding Norris's face on the big screens. Calm, expressionless. His jacket zipped to the middle of his chest, hands folded lightly over one knee. He didn't move, didn't answer, didn't blink away from the storm. And the more he sat, the more the silence worked on people. The laughter softened. The jeering stuttered. Even those who had cheered the insult now looked unsettled, unsure whether they were watching bravado or a mistake. The host tried one more time. Sir, let's remember. The fighter cut him off. Remember what? That he's too old? That he's just a name from another time? Ask him if he wants to prove me wrong. Ask him. The building held its breath. Chairs squeaked as people leaned forward. The air smelled of sweat, of spilled soda, of the hot plastic seats pressed together. Somewhere a fan dropped a bottle cap, the tiny click sharp as glass in the hush. Then the chant returned, harder now. Chuck! Chuck! Entire rows stood, fists pumping. The sound grew until it shook the banners overhead. The host looked down at his cue cards, then set them aside. He leaned into his mic, his voice quieter, steadier, aimed not at the fighter but at the guest section. Mr. Norris, he said carefully, would you like to respond? The eruption was instant. The crowd didn't cheer the host, they cheered the invitation. The walls shook as people leapt to their feet. Even the journalists clapped, some with cameras still rolling, as though they'd just been given a gift they didn't dare expect. The fighter leaned back, smiling wide, tapping the table like a drumbeat, already rehearsing whatever line he would spit over the top of the answer. But the room had left him. Every lens, every face, Every ounce of noise turned toward the still man in the third row. On the screens, Norris's eyes lifted, pale under the glare, steady as if the chaos weren't real. And for the first time all night, the young fighter stopped talking. The silence wasn't empty. It was a fuse, and everyone knew it was burning towards something they could not yet see. The invitation hung in the air like a blade, and every eye tracked the man it was meant for. 3 rows back, Chuck Norris moved at last. Not fast, not theatrical, just a shift of weight, the creak of a chair as he rose. The crowd reacted as if gravity itself had changed. People pushed out of their seats in unison, phones shaking in their hands. Reporters lifted cameras higher. Even the fighter on stage, grinning wide, tilted his head like a predator trying to measure prey. Norris stood straight, jacket falling back into place across his shoulders. He didn't rush. One step into the aisle, another, his shoes whispering against the floor. With each movement, the noise inside the hall warped, first louder, then sharper, then collapsing into a hush so dense it felt physical. The chants broke off, cut mid-syllable, leaving behind only the hum of the lights and the faint clicks of camera shutters. The fighter laughed into his mic, the sound forced, bouncing too hard against the walls. "You're serious? The crowd really wants this?" He slapped the table with a palm, forcing the microphones to thump. "Grandpa's gonna come down here and prove me wrong? Come on." It didn't land. No one laughed with him this time. A handful of fans shouted Norris's name. Others clapped in bursts, but most simply stared, stunned into stillness. Security leaned forward, uncertain whether to step in or step back. On the giant screen, the camera magnified his face. Lines cut deep by age, yes, but no hesitation, no fear. Just eyes that had seen too much to blink for anyone. The fighter tried again, desperation seeping into his grin. He leaned over the mic, voice pitched to mock. "Be careful on those steps, Chuck. Don't trip. Wouldn't want you breaking a hip before the fight even starts." The room barely reacted. Even the cruelest in the audience felt the joke was hollow. The only sound that mattered was the slow tread of Norris's steps as he walked closer to the stage. Reporters fumbled to capture every second. One held her camera so tightly her knuckles blanched. Another whispered, "This is already history," though no one around him needed reminding. Norris reached the edge of the dais and stopped. He didn't climb yet. He looked at the fighter, measured him the way a craftsman measures a plank, patient, exact, knowing whether it will hold before it's touched. The silence pressed until it became uncomfortable, then unbearable. The fighter shifted in his chair, trying to look casual, but his shoulders tightened. The host, almost forgotten, leaned toward his mic again, voice cracked but audible. "Mr. Norris, would you like to say something?" Norris stepped onto the platform. The sound was small, rubber sole on wood, but in the hall it thundered. He took the microphone the host offered, his hand steady. He held it low for a breath, letting the anticipation stretch until the audience leaned forward as one. His voice was calm, quiet, almost intimate, but carried across the room because everyone had decided to hear it. "I never fought for the crowd," he said. "Not once. Not when I was young, not now. But if someone wants to test whether I'm weak." He turned his eyes to the fighter, gaze steady enough to pin him in place. Then let him step into the first round. The silence fractured like glass. The crowd detonated, the release deafening. Some shouted his name. Others screamed wordless, high-pitched cries, the kind that come only when people know they're watching something that wasn't supposed to happen. On stage, the fighter's grin faltered, then returned sharper, almost manic. He clapped his hands together once, too loud, too quick. "You all heard him," he barked, trying to reclaim control. "First round. He's mine." But the noise was no longer his to command. Fans stood on chairs, pumping fists. Journalists shouted over each other, desperate for quotes. Security spoke frantically into radios. The big screen held the split shot. On one side, the young fighter, red-faced, straining to stay in control. On the other, Norris, calm as stone, microphone still in hand, unmoving, unshaken. And the audience understood what they were looking at. This was no longer hype for a card or a headline for tomorrow's paper. It wasn't a soundbite to be clipped and replayed online. This was a challenge, offered and accepted, in real time, with nowhere left for anyone to hide. For the first time all night, The young fighter stopped talking. And for the first time all night, Chuck Norris had spoken. The air in the room was electric, trembling with a question no one dared answer yet. Would this actually happen? The arena pulsed like a living machine. Every seat was filled, the air hot with breath, the floor vibrating under 1,000 restless feet. Overhead lights carved harsh white circles onto the canvas, and every step in the tunnels sent fresh ripples through the crowd. This was no longer just a fight card. It was a national event, already headlines before the bell. The young fighter came first. Music thundered, bass shaking the scaffolding as he burst from the tunnel with arms wide, chin high. He shadowboxed for the cameras, winked at the front row, and slapped his chest. The crowd that carried his name roared approval, flags and phones raised, flashes scattering like sparks. He reveled in it, turning his walk into a performance, making the octagon feel like his personal stage. Then the music cut. A quieter beat began, stripped of fireworks, almost stark. From the opposite tunnel, Chuck Norris walked out. No robe, no gloves thrown to fans. A plain jacket, calm steps, eyes fixed on the cage. No gestures, no acknowledgement, yet the noise doubled. Entire rows stood, chanting his name, hands clapping out of rhythm, but with conviction. It was the reaction of people who weren't entertained, but moved. The camera split showed the contrast clearly. On one side, the young man smiling like an actor at his premiere. On the other, the older man walking like a craftsman heading to work. The story was already written on their faces. At center, the referee ran through the rules. The fighter slapped Chuck's glove lightly, then pulled his hand back with a smirk, muttering something into the mic that made his section of fans howl. Chuck didn't rise to it. He only gave the smallest nod and stepped back. The bell cracked the air. The young man sprinted forward, fast, aggressive, barking words with each strike. A jab, then another, slapping the guard. Slow, he shouted, following with a kick to the calf. Weak, as he lunged again, his laugh sharp through the mouthguard. He danced, shoulders loose, daring the legend to respond. Chuck didn't. His movements were minimal, precise, like cuts with a blade. Half steps that turned big shots into glancing touches, small pivots that left hooks swiping at air. His breathing never changed. He didn't talk back, didn't smirk. Silence wrapped around him like armor. The crowd split in two currents, chants colliding. New era, answered by Chuck. Chuck. Phones bobbed above heads, catching every slip, every word. Commentators raised their voices over the noise, one insisting the younger man's pace would break the older fighter, the other marveling at how calmly Norris read each strike. Another flurry came, jab, cross, hook. The punches were fast, loud, the kind that drew cheers even when they missed. One clipped shoulder, another smacked into guard, the third cut across empty space. Norris angled out, not rushing, not countering. The restraint only deepened the tension. The fighter raised his arms to the crowd, grinning wide. That's your hero, he yelled. A section of fans screamed back in triumph. But the cameras stayed split, showing the other half of the story. Chuck's steady eyes, his stillness, his control. The pressure kept building. The younger man threw harder, louder, his voice rising with each strike. He tried to clinch, jammed a knee upward. Norris shifted his wrist inside, blocking the path with a small circle, and the strike thudded harmlessly against his hip. They broke clean. Chuck didn't even look rattled. The crowd roared again, not for damage, but for the fact that he hadn't bent. A new chant started high in the rafters, low and rough. Chuck! Chuck! It rolled downward, catching voices that hadn't shouted yet. The fighter threw his arms wide as if to silence them, but the noise only thickened. He tried again, louder. Granddad, you're done. He faked a level change, ripped an uppercut. Norris tilted, shoulder catching it. No reaction. Then he slid just out of range, letting the miss hang in the air. The audience gasped. Silence for half a beat, then a storm of noise. The younger man laughed, pointing at Norris as if the slip had been luck, but his grin had grown thinner, the edges tight. The clapper cracked for the last 10 seconds. The fighter pushed hard, hurling a wild combination, 2 jabs, and a heavy overhand meant to stamp his authority on the round. Norris moved once, a pivot off the center line. The overhand sliced across nothing but light. The fighter caught himself on the fence, mask of bravado barely holding. The horn ended it. No punches from Norris, No crowd-pleasing combinations, yet the arena was louder for him. The fighter sat on his stool talking too fast, gesturing wildly. Chuck sat in silence, forearms on knees, breathing steady, eyes forward. The camera held on his face, and the crowd roared again. What unnerved the fighter most wasn't what Chuck had done. It was what he hadn't, and everyone in the arena felt it. The silence was more dangerous than any punch. The second round began before the horn. The young fighter stood early, bouncing in his corner, mouthguard grinding, eyes darting toward the cameras that stalked the fence. He clapped his gloves together, playing conductor to a crowd already on edge. His coach murmured numbers and code words, but he wasn't listening. He was staring across the cage at the man who hadn't flinched once. Across the mat, Chuck rose with no urgency. He rolled his shoulders once, then simply waited, calm as stone. The bell snapped. The young man charged forward, jabs snapping, a kick thudding against shin, voice rising with every strike. Slow, he barked, then weak. As his cross hammered guard, the audience roared at the noise of impact, half of them convinced it meant dominance. Phones recorded nervously from the Chuck side. Faces clenched. A long press row, one writer muttered, "He has to answer at some point," while another scribbled furiously, "Patience or denial?" The younger fighter sensed that tension and fed on it. He swung harder, shouting, pointing to the crowd after a body shot landed against ribs. "There's your man," he yelled, raising his arms. Cheers rolled like surf. Chuck didn't give it back. He stayed small, shifting his feet by inches, turning punches into glances, letting knees catch hip bone instead of gut. Every miss looked like subtraction. His breathing never changed. The fighter pressed, eyes wild now, forcing exchanges. He jammed Norris into the fence and ripped a hook upstairs. It shaved hair, but found no chin. The grin returned anyway, brittle at the edges. "That all you've got?" He taunted, as if words might close the gap fists couldn't. In the stands, the split became clearer. Some shouted themselves hoarse, demanding a finish. Others stood frozen, waiting for something they couldn't name. A chant started small, "Chuck! Chuck!" and grew across the lower bowl until it met jeers from above. The sound turned chaotic, like two storms colliding in one sky. Then it happened. With less than a minute left in the round, the young fighter threw a three-punch combination, jab, hook, overhand. He lunged with full weight, convinced the ending reel was his. The jab missed. The hook grazed glove. The overhand carved air. And Norris stepped in. A short right hand. Nothing dramatic. A strike so clean and economical it almost looked casual. It landed square on the hinge of the jaw. No loud crack, just a muffled thud, but the younger man's head snapped, his knees dipped, his eyes blinked without permission. He staggered a half-step back, touching his jaw as though to confirm what had happened. The arena didn't react instantly. It needed half a second to register the reversal. Then it erupted. People jumped out of seats, screaming, phones forgotten in their hands. Reporters shouted over each other, voices raw. The chant exploded, louder than before. "Chuck! Chuck!" The young fighter forced a smile, shaking his head, trying to laugh it off. But his body betrayed him. Gloves held tighter, steps shorter, a tremor just beneath the bravado. His coach shouted instructions, but the noise buried them. On camera close-up, the boyish grin looked hollow, stretched over doubt he couldn't mask. Chuck didn't chase. He didn't celebrate. He stood exactly where he had, eyes locked, chest steady. It was restraint, but the crowd read it as domination. They understood the message. He could have finished, but chose not to. The final seconds ticked. The younger man, desperate to regain control, lunged with another wild flurry, 3 for punches. They all met guard in air. The horn saved him from overextending. He turned to his corner quickly, jaw tight, grin gone. His team swarmed, dabbing sweat, barking advice. But the cameras caught the flicker in his eyes, a flash of doubt he couldn't hide. His breathing was shallow now, his chest rising faster than the pace required. Across the cage, Chuck sat quietly, forearms on his knees, breathing as calm as if he'd been walking rather than fighting. He looked not at the crowd, not at the cameras, but directly at the man across from him. And the building felt the truth. The young fighter had landed more strikes, had played louder, had shouted harder. But the balance had shifted with a single precise blow. The noise of the arena proved it. Half of the chants that had cheered his name were gone, replaced by a steady roar of "Chuck," rolling through the tears like thunder. Some fans clutched their phones but forgot to record. Others shouted themselves hoarse, desperate to believe what they had just witnessed. Commentators were already framing the story, voices trembling with a mix of shock and excitement. That wasn't luck. That was timing. He waited, and he found it. The round ended with no knockout, no knockdown. Yet everyone in the arena knew something irreversible had just begun. The smile was gone, and so was the illusion. The break between rounds didn't feel like rest, it felt like a courtroom. The young fighter sat hunched, his coaches fanning him, shouting advice, but his eyes betrayed him. They flickered, restless, scanning the crowd as if looking for escape routes. He forced a smirk, then spat water onto the mat, but the cameras caught the tremor in his jaw. Across the cage, Chuck Norris sat still, forearms balanced on his knees. He didn't need words from his corner. His breathing was steady, the rise and fall of his chest almost unnerving after the storm of the last round. He hadn't looked tired, not once. And that quiet, more than the punch itself, had broken something in the younger man. The horn sounded for round 2, and the arena roared as if this were the main event of a lifetime. People stood, phones aloft, the lights of 1,000 screens flickering like fireflies. Online, clips of Norris's single punch were already viral, comments flooding in. He's not done. Not even close. The young fighter came out fast again, trying to project control. He raised his gloves high, pumping them for the cameras. "I'm still here," he shouted, voice straining to sound confident. But his feet told a different story. He moved sharply, but not freely. His eyes twitched each time Norris shifted, waiting for the next counter he couldn't see coming. Chuck advanced for the first time. No rush, no flurry, just pressure, measured, inevitable. The crowd felt it instantly. They surged to their feet, screaming, a chant starting in the lower sections and rolling upward. "Chuck! Chuck! Chuck!" The fighter tried to answer with volume. He threw a hard jab, then another, then a right hand that cracked against guard. The crowd cheered the noise of contact, but the cameras told the truth. Norris didn't move. He soaked the shots, then tilted slightly, and in the next breath he struck. A crisp 1-2, short and surgical. The first jab rocked the head back. The cross followed with quiet efficiency, snapping the mouthguard sideways. The young fighter stumbled, feet tangling for a second before he steadied himself. His grin was gone now. In its place was a flicker of panic. The commentators' voices cracked over the roar. "That's not luck. That's control." One shouted. He waited, and now he's dictating the pace. The crowd fed off the words, shrieking, clapping, some crying. Phones dropped as people forgot to film. The younger man lunged in desperation, throwing a looping hook. Chuck slipped it with minimal movement, pivoting to the outside, then answered with a short hook of his own. It wasn't heavy, but it was precise. It snapped the head sideways and forced the younger fighter to stumble back to the fence. The arena went insane. People pounded on chairs, screamed his name. Social feeds exploded with legend, and Chuck still got it. In the cage, the young fighter's eyes told the truth. His body still wanted to fight, but his mind had already cracked. He blinked hard, biting his mouthguard, shaking his head as if to convince himself. He raised his gloves high again, but the defiance looked smaller now, less certain. Chuck advanced slowly, eyes fixed, reading him. He threw another straight right, snapping the head back. A left hook followed, stiff and sharp, catching the cheek. The young fighter's legs wobbled. The referee leaned closer, watching. The crowd knew. They screamed for a finish. "End it! End it!" Echoed across the arena. Reporters stood half out of their chairs. Even the commentators fell silent, waiting. Chuck closed the distance. The younger man braced for a final storm, raising his guard high. But the storm didn't come. Instead, Norris stopped, a step away. He looked into the man's eyes, steady, and then he stepped back. The crowd gasped. It wasn't mercy. It was something colder. A choice. Norris lowered his hands slightly, gave a single nod, as if to say, "Decide for yourself. Do you want to keep going, or is it over already?" The fighter's chest heaved. His gloves twitched, but his eyes betrayed the truth. He was finished, whether the referee waved it off or not. The silence in his stare said it all. And then, the horn. The round ended. The sound of the bell was almost drowned by the eruption of the arena. People screamed, cried, hugged strangers. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others jumped up and down, fists in the air. Phones came back up, capturing faces wet with sweat and tears. The cameras caught the young fighter's expression as he slumped onto his stool. His body sat, but his eyes stayed locked on the floor. Fear, confusion, and something deeper, the shadow of realization. He hadn't just lost control of the fight. He'd lost the story. Across the cage, Chuck stood in his corner, breathing as calmly as when the night began. He didn't smile. He didn't raise his hands. He simply looked at his opponent with quiet finality, as if to say, the fight was never about punches. It was about who would break first. The crowd felt it. They didn't need a knockout to know the result. And as the camera zoomed in on the young fighter's face, sweat dripping, lips trembling, eyes full of fear, the cliffhanger froze itself into history. Everyone in the building understood. The fight was technically still on, but the real battle had already been decided.